Hi there. Okay, back in the shed. Okay, last haul. Here we go. So looking at development solutions, and liberalisation is one of these. When we've looked at this, we tend to look at the Washington Consensus, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But liberalisation in general, what it means is to try and make increased use of market forces, and a decreased role for the state. So decreased government intervention, decreased state management and so on. And the rationale is relatively straightforward, which is that generally, on average, businesses are better at allocating resources. They're trying to make profits. They have incentives to be efficient and so on. And therefore, we know historically that generally economies that are more free market have tended to grow faster than those that are state run. And if we look at countries like China and Vietnam, it's pretty clear that a movement away from kind of close government control and towards more use of markets has led to extraordinarily rapid rates of economic growth, 8, 9, 10% a year. So following from that, therefore, I think when we come to the end of this, what we're going to be saying is that introducing market forces in the right way, in an appropriate fashion, under the right circumstances and so on, can be beneficial. What we've tended to look at, though, is kind of the role of the IMF and the World Bank, and their sorts of recommendations. And historically, these have tended to involve kind of this twin or twofold approach to liberalisation, where you've got internal liberalisation on the one hand, where what the government's going to do is try and cut its spending, usually because it has a budget deficit. And therefore, it needs, if it's going to have low-cost finance in the future, it's going to need to bring its budget deficit and national debt under control. That will mean that if the government's borrowing less, it'll tend to decrease crowding out. So it'll mean that there's more funds available for private sector at lower interest rates. In the very long run, it might also allow tax cuts. Secondly, there's kind of an attempt to privatise. So generally, state-run businesses tend to be inefficient. If you put them into the private sector, then in theory they have incentives. If you get it right, there will also be competition, and as a result of which, in principle, the economy will grow. And finally, we're going to deregulate. So we're going to make it easier to set up businesses. We're going to make it easier for people to be entrepreneurial. To start a small business. So the goal there is to decrease barriers to entry, to increase competition, so to make sure there are no protected sectors, and to attract foreign direct investment, to allow foreign direct investment to come in. Externally, it's also about less government. So all these things are about less government intervention. We can also see the same thing externally as well. So external liberalisation means liberalisation of a country's relationships with the rest of the world. And again, it's reducing state intervention. So on the one hand, what we've got is that a country should decrease its protectionism. So decrease tariffs, decrease quotas, all that type of stuff. So that local firms have to compete with foreign ones. And at the same time, you float the exchange rate. And what that normally means, often, or at least countries with strong central government intervention often have overvalued exchange rates. Not necessarily the case, but because that allows you to bring in cheap imports of technology and that type of stuff. The IMF and the World Bank say don't do that. It'll be better if your exchange rate falls. So what normally happens is a decrease in exchange rate. Because what that'll do is it'll decrease the price of exports in foreign currency terms, and therefore promote growth. So the theory behind it then it's pretty logical, and it mirrors kind of much of what was going on in Britain and the United States during the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher. Basically it's all about it's a supply side revolution. It's all about an increase in competition, an increase in investment, increase in business. And all of those things. So by privatising, deregulating, cutting the role of the state, opening up the markets to competition, then what you're saying is we're hoping that there will be kind of supply-side growth, which will both create an increase in GDP and downward pressure on inflation. and hence improved living standards. Yeah? So that's the theory behind it. And as we said, it worked very well in Britain and the States, unless you care about equality. It's clearly if you look at China and Vietnam, both of those countries have gradually introduced market-based reforms over 20, 30-year period, and as they've gradually opened, what's happened is that a vibrant private sector has developed, and those countries have experienced very high levels of economic growth, which have generally been redistributed and have led to development. But it's not necessarily the case. If you try and do it too quickly, and that has tended to be the case with with kind of IMF structural adjustment programs, they tend to come in with quite a short time horizon. What then happens is that these reforms can be pretty damaging. So we know perfectly well that, say, cuts in government spending, obviously that's going to lead to cuts in basic services. There is a big danger that what's going to end up is that health and education are going to get cut. And since we need those to sustain long-term development, since they are indeed what long-term development is about, that's going to be problematic. We know that Cambridge University report on Ebola in Sierra Leone directly criticised the IMF for its policies in which Sierra Leone needed to cut government spending because they'd been forced to weaken their health service, which then meant that they were unable to control the Ebola epidemic of 4 or 5 years ago. When we look at privatisation, we looked at what Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank, had to say. And what he was saying was that in Latin America, when what happened there was that utilities were privatised, and what that did is it led to a big increase in the price of cooking gas, big increase in the price of water in countries like Bolivia, and obviously that's going to decrease living standards at least in the short term. When we look at FDI, we'll talk about separately, but when we look at kind of external liberalisation, if you decrease the exchange rate or you decrease protectionism, that then leads us to the Jamaican experience, in which what happened is that there was an increase in the price of their essential imports, like medicine. They were highly dependent on pharmaceuticals, many basic foodstuffs, educational supplies like books. So that damaged living standards. And at the same time, they were flooded with that's because of the decrease in exchange rate. But because they decreased protectionism, they were then flooded with heavily subsidised American powdered milk. So the Americans were giving subsidies of over 100% on the cost of production to their suppliers. And obviously you can't compete with that. And the result was the destruction of the Jamaican dairy industry, and they then became dependent on imported powdered milk from the United States. So it's a mixed picture. Done in the right way over an appropriate time period, it's obviously the case that markets have a place to have a role. That if you look at very, very strongly centralised economies, they haven't tended to grow very fast and they haven't delivered high living standards. But the pace at which you do it and the way in which you do it and the sectors in which you do it and how you introduce it, they're going to be critical in determining how successful liberalisation is likely to be. And it's worth bearing in mind that any liberalisation programme is likely to lead to short-term disruption, job losses, damage and lower living standards. And it's a question of how quickly that can be overcome.